The universe, as it turned out, had a very specific hierarchy, and humans, well, they were somewhere between adorably irrelevant and vaguely useful if you squint. This was the prevailing sentiment in the grand chamber of the collective Concord, where representatives from 14 sovereign species had gathered to discuss the future of a particularly uninteresting moon in the Thessian expanse. The room itself was a monument to over-engineering transparent aluminum walls that flickered with holographic displays, temperature zones calibrated to accommodate the vastly different biology of each delegate, and a central table that seemed to exist in at least 3 spatial dimensions simultaneously. Very impressive, very unnecessary for what was essentially a real estate negotiation. The Vrix ambassador reclined in his suspension pod, a gelatinous mass of consciousness that preferred to exist in a state of semi-liquid contemplation. His thoughts rippled across their neural network like thoughts through water, and his first contribution to the meeting was essentially a laugh, if laughter sounded like a sound made of wet static. The human has been assigned, he announced, and the chamber immediately filled with the auditory equivalent of chuckles from half the room. The human in question sat at the lowest section of the tiered conference table, which wasn't subtle symbolism at all. Her station was positioned at least 4 meters below the Krellian delegation, their insectoid forms clicking in amusement from their elevated perch. She didn't react. She never did. That was the thing about humans that actually bothered the higher species sometimes. They were so aggressively difficult to offend. This is precisely the kind of assignment that demonstrates our compassion. The Zephian envoy cooed, their crystalline exoskeleton catching the light in ways that suggested they'd evolved specifically to be distracting. We provide opportunities for lesser species to prove themselves. Growth through challenge. Character development. There was no irony in their tone. That was perhaps the most infuriating part of the entire situation. The moon in question, designated as Crater Station Theta 12 in the bureaucratic nomenclature, but known colloquially as the rock nobody wants, sat in disputed territory. The Vrix had claimed it. The Krellian colony ships wanted it for resource extraction. A newly emerging faction of the Aquithian collective had thrown their name into the hat for reasons that nobody quite understood, possibly including the Aquithians themselves. What made it interesting to anyone paying attention, which was essentially nobody, was that beneath its barren surface lay deposits of crystalline structures, with properties that made even advanced technology blush with envy. But it also sat in a geologically volatile region, the kind of place where plates shifted and magma churned with active enthusiasm. The previous 3 survey teams had been inconvenienced by the local seismic activity. That was the diplomatic term. Turned into charcoal was what actually happened. But that sort of vocabulary lacked sophistication. The human has proven adequate in her previous assignments. The Vrix continued, and the word adequate dripped with the kind of condescension that only beings who'd mastered 1,000 languages could achieve. The mineral deposits are secure through her efforts. This next task is delicate. A holographic projection materialized above the central table, and the gravity well of Crater Station Theta 12 rotated slowly before them. The visual was beautiful in the way that destructive things always are. Those rich colors of thermal activity, the suggestion of power lurking beneath the surface, the complete and utter unsuitability of the location for any biological organism that wanted to remain biological. We need the geological samples. The Krellian lead clacked, her mandibles working through the words with practiced precision. The structural composition of the substrate, specifically from the 3 deepest impact zones. The heat tolerance requirements are challenging. Challenging, the human said softly. The word carried no inflection, which somehow made it more pointed than if she'd infused it with the anger that probably simmered somewhere beneath her remarkable composure. Everyone in the chamber turned to look at her, as though surprised she was capable of independent thought. This happened frequently. You mean deadly? Deadly is such a loaded term. The Zephian smiled. And if you weren't listening carefully, you might have thought it was genuine. Let's call it demanding of specific physiological capabilities. The ambient temperature fluctuates between 200 and 300 degrees Celsius. The atmospheric pressure is... I know what it is, the human interrupted. I read the brief, twice, because apparently, I'm the species stupid enough to accept this assignment. There was silence, the kind of silence that suggested approximately 14 different species were simultaneously processing whether a human had just been rude to them. Then slowly, a series of whistles and trills began circulating through the chamber. Laughter. They were laughing. You see? The Vrix's amusement came through as bubbling consonants. This is why humans are so entertaining. They have no concept of self-preservation, combined with a complete absence of awareness regarding their own mortality. The psychological profile suggests something they call spite. Utterly fascinating. The human stood up. Her movements were deliberate, economical, the kind of physicality that suggested she'd spent a considerable amount of time learning how to move through spaces that weren't designed for her comfort. She addressed the chamber directly, and her voice was a masterpiece of control. Steady, calm. Underneath it, if you listened carefully, you could hear the edge of something that might have been fury, or might have been resignation, possibly both. When do I leave? She asked. Immediately, the Krellian representative chirped. We've prepared a vest, full life support, thermal regulation suit, all the usual accommodations for biological frailty. You'll have 30 hours to retrieve the samples before seismic activity in the region reaches critical levels, or you won't, and the next team can collect you along with the sample. Poetic, the human said. She picked up her equipment case, compact, efficient, designed by someone who understood that humans didn't get the luxury of elaborate tools. Anything else? Just one thing, the Zephian added, their crystalline form shimmering with what might have been concern or might have been anticipation. It was genuinely difficult to tell. The previous team sent their final transmissions from the impacts. They all said the same thing before their communications arrays were destroyed by the environmental conditions. Which was, this is impossible. The human didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply nodded, picked up her equipment, and walked toward the chamber exit. Behind her, the assembled representatives of the collective Concord watched her departure with the kind of attention usually reserved for watching something fragile walk toward a cliff. She won't make it, the Zephian whispered, not entirely without sympathy. Of course she won't, the Vrix agreed. But it will be interesting to see how long it takes. What none of them understood, what none of them could possibly understand, was that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history succeeding at impossible things, while everything more intelligent than they were kept explaining why it couldn't be done. The universe was about to get a very uncomfortable reminder of that fact. The human was already thinking about it. 3 specific sample extraction points, 287 degrees, at the hottest zone, seismic window of approximately 28 hours before critical activity, thermal suit with a maximum operational temperature of 315 degrees, narrow margin, uncomfortable, completely surmountable if you weren't the type to panic. She wasn't the type. As the transport vessel took her toward the geologically hostile moon that everyone else had surrendered to, she examined the samples of her previous work, the mineral deposits she'd already extracted from 2 different impossible locations. They glowed faintly in her equipment case, monuments to human stubbornness and everyone else's perpetual underestimation. In the grand chamber of the collective Concord, the representatives of 14 species settled back to their deliberations, already mentally allocating the humans' death benefits, and discussing which species would handle the 4th survey team. None of them noticed that the human had completed every assignment she'd been given. Despite each one being labeled likely unsurvivable, they simply assumed that she'd get lucky eventually. That probability would finally catch up with competence. They really should have done the math. The transport vessel descended through the sulfuric haze with all the grace of a brick deciding to take up aerodynamics as a hobby, not gracefully. In other words, the main viewport flickered with warnings, atmospheric density readings, thermal sensors screaming like they'd just discovered existential dread, radiation levels that would make most species reconsider their life choices within approximately 3 seconds. The human watched the data scroll past with the kind of concentration usually reserved for reading really good literature. She'd already cross-referenced the environmental readouts against her thermal suit specifications 4 times. The margins were slim enough that you could slip a quantum particle through them, but margins were margins. Slim was better than non-existent, which was what they'd been offering before. Her name was on none of the official documentation. Naturally, that was part of the joke. Expendable assets didn't get names in the collective bureaucracy. She was simply Human Survey Specialist 0847 in the official logs. a designation that perfectly captured the galaxy's ability to take something living and reduce it to a number. She'd stopped finding it offensive around Assignment 3. Now it was just background noise. The vessel's AI, which had a personality best described as aggressively helpful in the manner of a species that had never experienced genuine inconvenience, provided constant commentary on the descent. Thermal readings indicate surface temperatures of 292 degrees Celsius in the primary impact zone. Suit integrity currently optimal. Probability of system failure under prolonged exposure, 73%. Please acknowledge understand. Acknowledged, she said, already running through her mental checklist. Thermal suit integrity check. Radiation shielding, adequate. Sample collection apparatus, functional and triple redundant because she'd learned that lesson the hard way on Assignment 2. Extraction windows, precisely calculated down to the minute. Backup power cells, 5 of them, when most survey specialists would have carried 2. You understand what awaits you? The AI continued, and there was something almost mournful in its synthetic tone. It had probably been programmed to feel concerned about biological entities. How nice for it. I understand perfectly, she replied, which was true in ways the AI probably couldn't comprehend. She understood that 14 species had written her off. She understood that her previous successes had been categorized as lucky anomalies, rather than evidence of actual capability. She understood that back in the Grand Chamber, they were probably already conducting a formal betting pool about whether she'd survive the first hour. The vessel touched down on Crater Station Theta 12 with a sound that suggested the ground itself objected to the intrusion, which technically it did. The entire planetary crust was basically one massive tantrum waiting to happen. A geological adolescent with impulse control issues and access to lava. She sealed her thermal suit, checked the seals twice more because paranoia and competence were actually excellent companions, and stepped onto the surface. The world was hostile in the way that art was sometimes hostile, perfectly, deliberately, and with a certain aesthetic beauty that made you want to appreciate it right before it killed you. The primary impact zone stretched before her, a massive crater that suggested something very large and very angry, had punched the ground at some point in the distant past. The walls were layered with mineral deposits that caught the heat radiation and threw it back into the air like a light show performed by something that hated existence. Her thermal suit's display showed her skin temperature at a comfortable 37.2 degrees Celsius, which was genuinely impressive given that the ambient temperature outside would have boiled a standard biological entity to death in approximately 47 seconds. The suit's cooling systems hummed with quiet efficiency, and the radiation dampeners did their job without complaining. She'd specified every component herself. On a secure channel back to the collective Concord, an automated monitoring system was transmitting her vitals, location data, and environmental readings to approximately 40 different observers who were almost certainly treating this like entertainment. She could imagine them now, various species arranged around holographic displays, nursing beverages that suited their specific physiologies, placing bets on exactly how long she'd last. First sample location reached, she transmitted, more out of protocol than any genuine need to inform them. The first impact zone was, according to her calculations, the most accessible, relatively speaking. In terms of absolute accessibility, it was still profoundly hostile, but she'd worked with worse margin. She deployed the extraction apparatus, a device about the size of her torso that used precision drilling technology borrowed from at least 3 different species engineering traditions. She built it herself, of course. The collective had provided her with basic tools and the kind of dismissive attitude that suggested they didn't expect her to use them effectively. The drilling began. The suit's systems maintained her at optimal physiological levels, while the apparatus bit through rock that had spent millennia building up resistance to drilling. Around her the earth shifted subtly. Seismic activity. The readings indicated a minor tremor, nothing catastrophic yet. She had approximately 26 hours before the activity ramped up to the probable extinction levels that had killed the previous team. 26 hours for 3 sample extractions from locations increasingly deep in the impact zones, where the heat would intensify and the hostile geology would become actively aggressive rather than merely passively dangerous.
Behind her, back in the comfortable climate-controlled chambers of the collective Concord, something occurred to none of the 14 species watching her progress. She'd never once asked for help. She'd never once suggested the task was impossible. She'd never once acted like she was doing anything other than exactly what she'd been trained to do. The first sample emerged from the drilling apparatus, a crystalline structure that glowed faintly under the thermal radiation. Beautiful, valuable, extracted from a location that had allegedly killed the last 3 survey teams. She ran the analysis, verified the composition, and secured the sample into her collection case. 25 hours and 48 minutes remaining. The universe was about to learn why humans were occasionally terrifying when nobody was paying attention.
23 hours and 14 minutes into the mission, something went wrong. Well, something went wrong in the way that things go wrong when reality refuses to cooperate with predictions made by beings who'd never bothered to actually study the subject matter with any genuine enthusiasm. What everyone back in the collective Concord had classified as a minor geological disturbance turned out to be a full-scale seismic cascade. The ground beneath her position began to shake with the kind of intensity that suggested the planet's internal organs were staging a violent protest. The thermal suit's stabilizers kicked into overdrive, and the heads-up display started throwing warnings at a rate that would have been comical if the warnings weren't approximately 50% accurate about imminent threats. She was at the second sample extraction site, the one that had killed the previous survey team approximately 14 hours into their operation. The readings suggested massive tectonic movement happening 3.2 kilometers beneath her position, which meant somewhere around here, the Earth was about to reorganize its geological opinions. Most species, when faced with this scenario, would have panicked. The Vreeks would have probably achieved consciousness expansion in their panic. The Zephians would have executed some kind of crystalline vibration that might have been meditation or might have been the geometrical equivalent of a nervous break. The Krillians would have clicked themselves into oblivion. She looked at the seismic readout, calculated the epicenter trajectory, and moved approximately 40 meters to the northwest. 3 seconds later, the ground where she'd been standing collapsed inward, as a fault line decided it had had enough of the surface world and wanted to reconnect with the magma chamber that fed its existence. A crater within a crater, opening up like a mouth ready to swallow anything foolish enough to remain in its path. Seismic event detected. Her suit's system reported with the kind of calm that only came from not actually understanding what was happening. Recommend immediate evacuation. Negative, she said, her eyes on the geological data streaming across her display. The fault line had opened up a previously sealed chamber, and in that chamber the mineral deposits were more concentrated than anywhere else on the planet. The readings were almost beautiful in their dense, pure crystalline structures, exactly what the collective needed, exactly where the previous teams would have been standing when the ground had eaten them. She ran the calculation. The aftershock window would last approximately 17 minutes before secondary seismic activity turned the entire region into something resembling a geological blender. She had what amounted to a geological invitation to either get the samples or die trying. Since she'd never been the type to turn down invitations, she started moving. The descent into the newly opened chamber was technically outside the mission parameters. The collective had sent her to extract samples from 3 specific impact zones. They hadn't explicitly forbidden her from extracting samples from previously inaccessible locations that had just been revealed by planetary tantrum. Technically, the heat increased dramatically as she descended. 292 degrees became 301 degrees, then 305. Her thermal suit's display showed the margin closing. The maximum operational temperature was 315 degrees, and she was approaching it with the kind of steadiness that suggested she'd done this before, which, in a manner of speaking, she had. Back at the collective Concord, the observers monitoring her progress were experiencing what could only be described as a collective nervous breakdown, transmitted through multiple species' interpretation of anxiety. Her suit's approaching thermal limits, one Vreeks observer noted, their consciousness rippling with something that might have been concern or might have been fascination. She's deviating from the approved route, a Krillian technician clicked frantically. She's moving toward the newly opened chamber. That wasn't, we didn't approve that. Can we issue a recall? The Zephian coordinator asked, their crystalline form vibrating slightly. We can, said the Vreeks. She won't acknowledge it. They were right. She wouldn't acknowledge it because she wasn't listening. Communication channels were background noise. The only voices that mattered were the ones generated by the geological data, the thermal readings, and the precise mathematical calculations running through her mind like music performed by the universe itself. The chamber opened before her like a cathedral built by forces that cared nothing for architecture or aesthetics. The walls glowed with concentrated mineral deposits, and at the chamber's center lay a formation so pure it looked like crystallized starlight had decided to take physical form. She had approximately 9 minutes remaining in the seismic window. She moved with the kind of efficiency that suggested she'd never wasted a motion in her life. The extraction apparatus came out, was deployed, and began its work with the precision of something that understood exactly what it was supposed to do. Around her, the earth continued its internal reorganization, tremors running through the rock like periodic reminders that geological systems didn't particularly care about survey schedules. "What is she doing?" a Krillian observer demanded. "The chamber is structurally unstable. Those tremors will trigger a cascading collapse." "We need to—" "She knows," the Vreek said quietly, and there was something in their tone that suggested they'd just had an uncomfortable realization. The human knew. She'd read the seismic data, understood the underlying geological patterns, and calculated exactly when the chamber would remain stable and exactly when it would collapse. She was operating within those margins with the precision of someone who'd spent a considerable amount of time learning to work in impossible spaces with impossible deadlines. The second sample emerged. Then the third, both extracted from a location that had supposedly been inaccessible, both representing the most concentrated mineral deposits on the planet, both removed with the kind of surgical precision that made it look easy. She had 47 seconds remaining in the seismic window. She sealed the samples into her collection case, initiated the ascent sequence, and climbed out of the chamber exactly as the Earth decided to reorganize once more. The chamber collapsed behind her with the sound of a world having second thoughts about letting anything interfere with its geological processes. She emerged onto the surface as the primary seismic cascade reached its peak. The ground around her cracked and shifted, but she was already in motion, already calculating the next safe location, already moving toward the extraction point, with the kind of tactical awareness that came from understanding that hesitation was the only enemy worth fearing. The seismic activity didn't stop. It intensified. The entire impact zone became something resembling an active war zone waged between opposing tectonic plates, and she moved through it like she'd been choreographed specifically to avoid every hazard. Back at the collective Concord, the observers were silent, genuinely profoundly silent. They were watching a species they'd classified as physically fragile, intellectually limited, and generally unsuitable for complex tasks, systematically extract mineral samples from a geological nightmare that had killed every other survey team approximately 7 hours into operations. Zephian began, then stopped. Whatever they were going to say clearly didn't have adequate vocabulary in any language they spoke. Still breathing, the Vreeks confirmed, their consciousness doing something that might have been meditation, or might have been shock, still transmitting vital, still moving. The human reached the extraction point with 5 hours and 32 minutes remaining on her mission clock. She'd completed the 3 primary sample extractions, acquired 3 additional samples from the newly accessible chamber, and demonstrated a working knowledge of geological dynamics that rivaled some of the collective's specialized AI systems. She transmitted her status update, all samples secured, suit integrity at 97%, and ready for extraction. "Well," the Vreeks said slowly, consciousness rippling with something that might have been the first genuine respect they'd ever felt for a biological entity. "That was not what we expected. What do we tell her?" a Krillian observer asked. "I believe," said the Zephian coordinator, their crystalline form reflecting light in new patterns. "We tell her welcome back." But they weren't thinking about welcoming her back at all. They were thinking about recalculating every assumption they'd ever made about human capability, and they were realizing, with the kind of slow horror that came from genuine intellectual awakening, that they might have been catastrophically embarrassingly wrong. The extraction vessel descended through the thermal haze like a phoenix descending to retrieve its chick, which was a thoroughly overwrought metaphor but also disturbingly accurate, given that everything about this rescue operation had stopped making conventional sense approximately 4 hours ago. She stood at the designated landing zone,
Collection case secured. Thermal suit displaying a status report that suggested it had been pushed to approximately 98% of its operational limits, and was genuinely curious about whether it would maintain structural integrity during the ascent. The seismic activity continued its geological tantrum in the distance, the ground rolling and cracking like something alive and angry, which technically it was. The extraction vessel's bay doors opened, and she walked through them with the kind of casual dignity that could only come from someone who just accomplished something that 13 different species had collectively decided was impossible. The doors sealed behind her with a pneumatic hiss, and the vessel immediately began its ascent sequence. She removed her thermal suit in the decontamination chamber, revealing skin that was flushed from the environmental exposure but entirely intact. Her collection case sat on the examination table, and the samples inside glowed faintly in the specialized containment field, proof of achievement in crystalline form. Nobody had expected her to make it back. That was the universe's first mistake. Nobody had expected her to make it back with 6 samples instead of 3. That was mistake number 2. What they really hadn't expected was for her to return with the structural integrity readings of those samples suggesting they were pure, more concentrated, and more valuable than anything the collective's own mining operations had ever produced. The vessel emerged from Crater Station Theta 12's atmosphere and transmitted its payload data back to the collective Concord. Within approximately 3 seconds, the grand chamber erupted into something resembling controlled chaos, if you were being very generous with the term control. The readings cannot be accurate, a Krillian technician was clicking frantically. The purity levels exceed theoretical maximum by 17%. The thermal gradients necessary to produce such concentration, no biological entity could have survived long enough to extract them. And yet the Vreeks observed, their consciousness seeming to vibrate at a frequency that suggested genuine intellectual discomfort. Here we are. The human arrived at the Grand Chamber 37 minutes after the initial data transmission. She'd showered, changed into standard atmospheric clothing, and walked through the corridors of the collective Concord, with the kind of understated confidence that came from having survived something that everyone else had categorized as fate. The lower-tier species they passed, various minor civilizations that hadn't quite achieved full voting status in the collective, actually turned to watch her walk past. Word travels fast in bureaucracies, especially word about someone catastrophically exceeding expectations. She entered the Grand Chamber through the lowest entrance, as protocol dictated, but something fundamental had shifted in how that entrance felt. The representatives of 14 species were arranged in their traditional hierarchy, suspended platforms positioned at various heights to correspond with their civilizational advancement. The humans stood at the lowest point of the chamber floor, but that seemed like a much smaller detail than it had been 6 hours ago. The samples, the Vreeks began, their consciousness rippling with patterns that suggested complex processing was occurring, exceed all specification. The extraction methodology, as Zephian Crystal added, their form reflecting light in genuinely confused patterns, appears to have incorporated techniques that we were not aware you possessed. We initiated a post-mission analysis of your movement patterns. The Krillian lead clicked, and there was something in their tone that approximated humility. For a species that breathed through their mandibles, that was genuinely impressive. Your seismic prediction calculations were more accurate than our primary AI systems. Your thermal management of the suit exceeded the design specifications by approximately 8%. Your geological knowledge of impact crater formations demonstrates understanding that would typically require at least 700 hours of specialized education. The human listened to this with the kind of expression that suggested she was hearing something only mildly surprising. She'd always known this. She'd known it when they assigned her the impossible task. She'd known it while she was extracting samples from chambers that shouldn't have been accessible. The surprise was only that it had taken them this long to arrive at the obvious conclusion. How did you accomplish this? The Zephian asked, and there was genuine curiosity in the question now. The kind of curiosity that came from intellectual humbling. I read the literature, she said simply. Every geological survey, every seismic analysis, every thermal study ever conducted on the planet. I cross-referenced the data, ran the calculations, and identified the optimal extraction points. I designed the apparatus myself, because I understood what was needed better than your engineers did. I extracted the samples because the task required completion, and nobody else was going to complete it. There was silence. The kind of silence that suggested multiple species were simultaneously experiencing the realization that they'd completely miscalculated something fundamental about how capability actually worked. You see, the Vreeks said slowly, their consciousness achieving something like philosophical clarity. The difficulty is that we measure intelligence by technological advancement and biological complexity. The human measures it by results. Which brings us to the matter of reassessment. The Krillian lead continued. Your classification within the collective hierarchy requires revision. The species classification standards demand that any civilization demonstrating this level of achievement must be reclassified as advanced. The human interrupted. I know the criteria, but before you do that, I want something understood. Everyone in the chamber leaned forward, metaphorically or literally, depending on their physiology. This was the moment where the human species would demand representation, resources, or recognition. This was the moment where they would attempt to leverage their sudden achievement into political gain. I didn't do this for the collective, she said quietly. I did it because I was given a task, and I completed it. I did it because humans don't accept impossible as a final answer. I did it because you were betting against me, and winning bets against beings who don't think much of you is its own reward. She placed the collection case on the central examination table, and it slid toward the elevated platforms where the real power existed. Those samples will make your mining operations profitable and help your military programs advance. They'll give you resources to expand your territory and develop new technology, and you'll do all of that while continuing to underestimate where they came from and why they exist in the quality they do, because that's what civilizations do when they've already decided something is beneath their consideration. She turned to leave. Wait, the Zephian called out. Will you take additional assignments? Will you help us with other impossible tasks? The human paused at the chamber entrance. She turned back, and for the first time, something like humor crossed her expression. I'm sure you'll find other species to do your dangerous work, though I'm willing to bet that they won't do it as well, and you probably won't figure out why until much later. She walked out of the grand chamber, and behind her the representatives of 14 advanced species stood in stunned silence. What they still didn't understand, what they probably wouldn't understand for another 100 years or so, was that humans had spent their entire history being underestimated and overcoming obstacles that should have destroyed them. The galaxy had just encountered a single specimen of the species, and they'd treated her like an experiment in a nature documentary. That was fine. Humans were good at proving people wrong. Genuinely, phenomenally good at it. 2 weeks later, Crater Station Theta 12 experienced a catastrophic geological collapse. The seismic activity that had plagued the region for millennia suddenly intensified to impossible levels. The impact zones collapsed inward in a cascading series of failures that left a crater so profound and so geometric in its precision that every geological model ever created by the collective had to be revised. The human watched the reports from her quarters, where she'd been reassigned to a middle-tier position that paid approximately 3 times what her previous role had offered. Nobody quite understood why the crater had formed with such mathematical precision, creating a perfect hemisphere that seemed almost deliberately sculpted by intelligence, rather than geology. She knew. She'd calculated the seismic cascade points months ago. She'd designed the sample extractions, specifically to trigger the cascade at precisely the right moment. The crater was a message, a perfectly geometric reminder that humans didn't just survive in hostile environments. They left their fingerprints on world. In the Grand Chamber, the Vreeks studied the crater data and achieved consciousness expansion of a different sort. She left that message deliberately. They realized, the crater is too perfect, too precise. She engineered the geological collapse to create a monument. The Zephian finished, their crystalline form reflecting light in new patterns of understanding. A measurement of her strength, not to impress us, to remind us. The Krillian lid clicked thoughtfully. We offered her nothing but impossible tasks, and dismissed her species as weak. And she didn't just complete the impossible, she made it beautiful. Somewhere in the depths of Crater Station Theta 12's newly formed crater, in a perfectly geometric center that should have been impossible to create, through natural means. There existed a crystalline formation that glowed faintly under its own thermal radiation, a final sample that she'd left behind intentionally. The universe had measured her strength and found it profound. But more importantly, it had found something else, a species that didn't need permission to be extraordinary, didn't require approval to accomplish the impossible, and would take the universe's contempt and turn it into monuments that would outlast civilization. Humans had always been good at that. The galaxy was finally catching up.